let you record. Sorry about that.
Yeah, it says recording is in progress.
Thank you so much. All right, I think I've logged in using a different login. All right, so yes, just a very brief introduction. As the work is already starting in the background, you might be hearing some drilling. But we're very happy today to be hosting Dr. Lago, who is an assistant professor at the Institute for Romance Languages and Literatures at the Goethe University of Frankfurt, as I just said. And in her own words, she actually studies sentence comprehension in native and non-native speakers of different languages, with the goal of figuring out how humans represent and use the grammatical knowledge, and how their knowledge changes when they're exposed to a new language. And the methodologies she uses are eye tracking, neurophysiological methods, and she uses this evidence to build cognitive models of the representations and processes that underlie real-time language processing. And some of her recent publications, just as an example, very relevant to our center as well, are antecedent access mechanisms in pronoun processing, evidence from the N400, published recently in Language Cognition and Neuroscience, and also Gratchen and Yuksek as the first author with Dr. Lago and other authors. And the name of the paper is, the title of the paper is The Interpretation of Anaphors in Heritage Turkish Speakers. And we very recently actually read that paper in the Theme 1 reading group. And today she will be talking to us about finding cross-linguistic influence in syntactic processing, likely and unlikely places. So without further ado, we can give her a silent applause of welcoming, and she can start. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Alexandra. Can you all hear me okay? Is the sound okay? All right, so let me share my screen so you can see what I see. It's good to see so many people. If you don't mind, if some of you can leave your cameras on while I talk. I found that I find it really alienating to talk to black screens. So I start being normal and suddenly I start worrying, am I the only one speaking? And then it gets really weird. So if at least one or two of you can still appear there, so I recreate human interaction in my head, that would be helpful. Okay, now let me, right. Is that good for you, the screen? Yeah. All right. So, and one thing I wanted to ask you is, how do you want to do with questions? Do you normally just ask when you have a question, or is it at the end of the talk? How do you do this?
It's usually at the end of the talk, but if somebody has a burning question, also you let us know if that's not okay to interrupt you during the talk, but we usually do it at the end. So.
Okay, so yeah. Whatever is better for you. So if there's something that is a comprehension question, maybe just stop me, because I don't want to just go ahead and everyone is wondering what I'm talking about. Yeah. And I can also, I structure the talk such that there's a break in between. So maybe in the break we can also talk if you have something you want to ask.
Excellent.
All right. So yeah. So again, thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here, at least virtually. And what I want to do in the to talk today is to tell you about some recent experiments where we set out to look for cross-linguistic influence. And while we ended up finding some evidence of cross-linguistic influence, it was not always in the ways we had expected. So I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts and also about your own experiences with cross-linguistic influence. There we go. So the starting point for my research is the observation that acquiring languages as an adult is harder and has more variable outcomes than acquiring languages as a child. And the interesting question, of course, is why? What makes it harder to learn languages as an adult than as a child? And there are many differences in how children and adults learn languages, including the type and amount of input, their motivations, and their biological makeup. And while all these factors are likely to play some role, my work focuses on another difference, which is that adults already have at least one language in place when they start learning a new language. So it's possible that their previous learned languages, their language background, affects their ability to use properties or features that differ cross-linguistically. In my work, I explore the role of cross-linguistic influence in the domain of syntactic processing. I'm interested in speakers who are very proficient or advanced in their foreign languages, and I want to find out whether, even at this advanced stage, their language background affects how they parse sentences during real-time comprehension. So the experiments that I'll tell you about today were all focused on the processing of one grammatical construction, possessive pronouns, which are words like his or her in English. And I'm interested in possessive pronouns because I think that they are potentially very useful to probe for cross-linguistic influence, given that their grammatical constraints vary across languages. So for example, in English, possessive pronouns only need to agree in gender with their possessor noun. So if the possessor is, for example, Miss Wagner, as the sentence that you see on the screen, the possessive form is her. But if the possessor were masculine, for example, John, the possessive would be his. By contrast, in Romance languages like Spanish, possessives only mark gender agreement with the following possessee noun. The morphological agreement marker has been lost in the third person. So in Spanish, you say su for the possessive, regardless of the gender of the possessee noun. But the agreement relationship is still instantiated morphologically in the other grammatical persons. So for example, a Spanish speaker says, vimos a nuestro hermano, but vimos a nuestra hermana. And finally, you have languages like German, which make everything complicated as usual with German. And in German, possessive pronouns encode both types of agreement relationships. So German possessives need to simultaneously agree in gender with their possessor and possessee noun. Possessor agreement is marked by the stem of the pronoun. So for example, if the possessor noun is Miss Wagner, the stem of the pronoun is ia. But if the possessor were Mr. Wagner, the stem of the pronoun would change. And in addition, the suffix of the pronoun marks possessee agreement. In the sentence on the slide, the suffix is en for a masculine possessee, but it would be different for a feminine possessee noun. So for example, sister. What this all means is that German possessives simultaneously express two agreement relationships, one that is present in English, one that is present in Spanish. So when thinking about English and Spanish learners of German, if there is cross-linguistic influence, we might expect that learners have an easier time computing these relationships when they are also present or instantiated in their native language, in their L1. Specifically, when thinking about real-time comprehension, we might expect English speakers to have an advantage computing possessor agreement in German, since this relationship is common to both languages. And by the same logic, we might also expect Spanish speakers to have an advantage computing possessee agreement, because this relationship exists in both Spanish and German. All good up to here? You're surviving the German pronouns? Okay, good. So what do we know about cross-linguistic influence with possessives in comprehension? When we started the project, we didn't really have a lot of evidence about comprehension, but we did know that the production of possessive pronouns is quite error-prone in language learners. So for example, Romance speakers like me often make errors with English possessive pronouns. In the slide, you have some actual errors produced by French teenagers that are learning English in school in Montreal. And when you zoom in on these errors, you can see that they seem to specifically occur in environments in which the possessor and possessee noun mismatch in gender. In this configuration, the French speakers seem to be making the possessive agree with the following noun, as would be grammatical in French, instead with the possessor noun, which is what is required by English. So this suggests that they are incorrectly transferring their French syntax to English, consistent with cross-linguistic influence. If the same type of influence occurs in comprehension, we would expect learners to be susceptible to errors in the same type of mismatch environments that elicit errors in production. So our question was, is this the case? Do we also see cross-linguistic influence in comprehension? So in the rest of the talk, I'm going to try to answer this question by showing you comprehension studies that systematically compared English and Spanish learners of German. And I'm going to look at each of these two relationships in turn. So first, I'll focus on possessor agreement, and I'll describe two experiments that looked at multilingual speakers, meaning people who know 2 or more languages. And then I'll move on to possessee agreement, and I'll describe some recent eye tracking work where we compared bilingual speakers of German who had either Spanish or English as their native language. And I want to say, the first part of the talk, which is on possessee agreement, I actually discussed this once also in your group, but in a different occasion. So this might be a bit repetitive for some of you. But I'll try to go faster in this part. And the second part is new. It's new eye tracking data that we managed to collect before Corona started in Germany. So let's start with possessor agreement. In the experiments on possessor agreement, we worked with multilingual speakers and we asked whether their previously learned languages influenced how they processed German possessive pronouns. Our experiments looked at a specific type of multilingual speakers, which are sometimes called trilinguals. These are speakers, in our case, who knew both Spanish and English, and they were learning German as a third language. And crucially, we varied the distribution of Spanish and English as their native or as their foreign language. So the first group were English native speakers who had learned Spanish as a second language and were now learning German. They were working in Germany. The other group had the mirror or reverse distribution. They were Spanish native speakers who spoke English as a second language and were now learning German as a third language. So what do we know about third languages? Well, we don't really have any models of how trilingual speakers process sentences, but there are competing theories about how the acquisition of a third language may be affected by previous languages. So for example, in speakers that are starting to learn a third language. And in particular, there are some models that propose that only a speaker's native grammar is transferred to the third language. The reasoning tends to be that your native language is more internalized, is the one that you have had longer exposure to. So maybe that's the one that you rely on when you need to learn a foreign or L3 language. By contrast, there are other accounts that propose that speakers only transfer their foreign grammar. The reasoning here, I think it's that your foreign language, for example, your L2, is the one that you're explicitly aware of or that you associate with the process of learning a new language. So when you tackle the task of learning yet another foreign language, maybe that's the one that you perceive, your second language is the one that you perceive as more relevant because you have acquired in similar circumstances. And finally, there's a third type of account that I'm sure you're all very much more familiar and experts on than me, which is typological. It's a class of accounts really. They're called typological primacy accounts. And the idea in these accounts is that learners only transfer the grammar that is typologically closer to the third language. So for example, a learner of German is more likely to transfer English than Spanish because English is more similar to German than Spanish typologically. Importantly, all these models assume that only one of the grammars of a multilingual person is transferred to the L3. So either the native grammar, the second language grammar, or the typologically closest grammar. And what we wanted to see was whether both grammars played a role, and we used an analysis that allowed us to address that question. And I'll tell you about that in a bit. So this is some information about our two groups of speakers. We can talk about them more if you want, but I just want to point out, we try to match them in variables that are known to affect processing, such as the age of acquisition and proficiency in German. And we also try to we also tried to make sure that they knew about possessor agreement, which is the phenomenon that we were interested in testing. So after our experiments were done, participants had to complete like a multiple choice where they had that probed specifically for their knowledge of possessor agreement. It was of course in German, but I'm giving you the English equivalence. And this is really an important thing, because if one is interested in figuring out if an effect happens in processing, the first is to check is that the learner has knowledge of the construction of interest. Because of course, if someone doesn't know or hasn't acquired a grammatical constraint, of course, they're going to have problems using it, but that's not so informative because they don't know it. So we wanted to make sure that we were testing processing difficulties. So for that, we made sure that our learners could perform well in the absence of time constraints, so that they knew possessor agreement in German. And because of that, the results I'll show you are only on a subset of our comprehenders, which are the ones that score more than 75% accuracy in the possessor test in an untimed manner, right? So that's what I'm showing you here on the top and on the bottom. There's a lot of variability. So we only take people who are 75 or more % accuracy with possessor agreement in the untimed test. And that leaves 25 speakers in the English native group and 21 speakers in the Spanish native group. All right, so let me tell you about our materials. Our materials were sentences that had possessor agreement violations, which are, as you have heard, unacceptable in German and English, but not in Spanish. In particular, we had a 2x2 design where we manipulated whether the sentence had a possessor violation and also the gender overlap between the two nouns in the sentence. So with regard to the possessor violation, we compare sentences where the pronoun either agreed or disagreed with the possessor noun in gender. For example, in the felicitous condition, participants would see sentences like Mrs. Schmidt kissed her mother. And in the infelicitous condition, the sentence was something like Mrs. Schmidt kissed his mother. Okay. And notice that I'm calling this felicitous because these sentences are not strictly ungrammatical, right? It could be that Mrs. Schmidt is a very affectionate person and is kissing someone else's mother. So this is not an ungrammatical sentence per se, but we know from previous studies that comprehenders prefer to have a sentence and an antecedent within the sentence. So they show processing difficulty when they have to posit an antecedent outside the sentence. So I'll refer to this as infelicitous. Okay, so for the possessor violations, we were interested in whether English native speakers whose grammar also encodes possessor agreement were more able to notice the violations than Spanish native speakers whose grammar does not encode possessor agreement. This pattern of results would be consistent with L1 influence, such that English speakers' native grammar could give them an advantage, a boost, processing German possessives. The second factor that we manipulated was the gender match between the possessor and the possessee noun. So in the match conditions, both nouns had the same gender, while in the mismatch condition, they had different genders. So for this, we kept the possessee noun constant. So for example, it was always mother in the item you're seeing on the screen. And we varied the possessor noun. For example, in the felicitous mismatch condition, the sentence was Mr. Schmidt kissed his mother. Okay, so this is a perfectly grammatical sentence. It's only that the two nouns have different genders. So why are we doing this? Why are we doing this exercise in convoluted agreement patterns? Well, recall that in production, Roman speakers make errors specifically in mismatch configurations, where the possessor and the possessee noun disagree in gender. In these configurations, it's where Roman speakers seem to transfer their L1 syntax, such that they wrongly agree the pronoun with the possessee noun. So if this type of cross-linguistic influence happens also in production, we would expect Spanish comprehenders to make errors specifically in mismatch configurations, meaning in the same configurations that elicit errors in production. in comprehension, the mismatch effect, if it occurs, should have opposite consequences in felicitous and infelicitous sentences. So in felicitous sentences, the mismatch manipulation should reduce acceptability. Specifically, if Spanish speakers transfer their L1 syntax and wrongly compute agreement between the stem of the pronoun and the possessive noun, they will incorrectly reject the sentence in the mismatch condition when the pronoun stem disagrees with the possessive. So for example, his mother. On the other hand, let's consider what happens in an infelicitous sentence. Here, the sentence is bad because it has a possessor violation, but in the mismatch condition, the pronoun stem is agreeing with the possessive noun. So if Spanish speakers transfer their L1 syntax, they will incorrectly accept the sentence in the mismatch condition when the pronoun stem agrees with the possessive noun. For example, her mother. So this should make an otherwise infelicitous sentence more acceptable for the Spanish speakers. So to summarize, if Spanish speakers are transferring their L1 syntax, they should be particularly error-prone in mismatch configurations. In this regard, they should differ from English native speakers who should not make this type of mistakes. Is the reasoning for this, does it make sense to you? It's a bit convoluted, but just to be clear, I think it's just to bear in mind that in comprehension, where you have both felicitous and infelicitous sentences, you should see a mismatch effect, but it should actually pull in opposite directions, right? So a mismatch effect should make an otherwise good sentence sound worse, and an otherwise bad sentence sound better for the Spanish speakers if what they're doing is wrongly computing agreement between the stem of the pronoun and the possessive noun. So if you have questions, now would be the time to ask me, because if not, I'll just assume that this is good.
Sorry, did you explain how this works in German? Maybe I missed it because I was on offline for a bit.
Okay. In German, so
what agrees with what?
Right. The suffix of the pronoun, so in this case, the final E, that agrees with mother, right? So it's seine Mutter, and if it was Vater, so father, it would be seinen Vater. So the suffix agrees with what follows. The stem agrees with what precedes. So if it's a feminine possessor, it's ihr, and if it's a masculine possessor, it should be sein.
Okay, thank you.
So a German speaker, a German native speaker.
So you have on the same, so it's both gender and case.
Right. So
so you don't expect English speakers also to have maybe a problem with that?
The suffix agrees in case. That's what you're saying, right? For the suffix.
Both it's gender and case, right? Because the E is both accusative and feminine, where en is accusative and masculine.
Yeah.
Whereas in English is only gender.
Right. Yeah, that's a very good point. So I think we know that case tends to be problematic both for second language learners and also sometimes for heritage speakers. So what I would assume is that the learners, the L2 learners, L3 learners, might be worse at noticing the violations than German native speakers, but I wouldn't expect that to differ between English and Spanish native speakers, because for both speakers, there's no case in possessive pronouns, right?
Right.
So you're right, there could be, because it's syncretic, and this is not just gender, but gender and case, there could be, and actually number too, it's singular.
Right.
There could be problems there, but I would not expect the two groups to be differentially affected by that. So, all right. So, wait, there's someone in the chat. Let me just. Jorge, yes. Maybe you can say it orally.
Sorry, I'm just not very, I know I will be very long-winded, so I thought, well, maybe in written form it will take, again, this might be just basically irrelevant, but you were kind of pointing out that in production where you see these errors is when there's a mismatch within the gender of the possessive pronoun and the possessee, right, which is what agrees in Spanish, and you were saying like, well, it seems that CLI is kind of triggered in these configurations, so let's test these and so on. And I was just like, I mean, then again, this might not really affect.
Hello?
Yeah, I think.
Or you got muted.
Sorry, yeah, somehow I muted myself. You seem to be assuming that CLI only happens in those configurations, and I wonder whether it's just that you only see it in those configurations, but whether the controller of the agreement relation shifted to the POSIX C is something that you just cannot tell in configurations where the possessor and the possessee have the same gender, right? But that doesn't mean that's not happening. I mean, again, I don't know whether this has an impact on how you interpret your results afterwards, but I'm guessing like, well, it might just be that there's always cross-linguistic influence from Spanish, and you just, you only see it when there's a mismatch, right? That's the informative condition.
Yeah, no, you're totally right. I think that's a more accurate way to put it. If Spanish speakers are always trying to agree the stem of the pronoun with what follows, that should happen in all kinds of trials. And like you pointed out, in match configurations, that will not make them worse, right? Because they will get to the same result, to the expected. So here, for example, here, yeah, if they expected to agree with mother, that will give them the right answer, like the sentence is acceptable. So what happens is just that it has a detrimental effect in comprehension only in mismatch configuration, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's a better way to put it. Yeah. All right, so, okay. Right, so to recap, we're interested in two effects in this design. The first is the effect of possessor violations, meaning can the learners detect a possessor violation? And for that, we're going to compare their acceptance rates of infelicitous and felicitous sentences. And the second effect, and we're interested, is the effect of the match between the nouns. And for that comparison, we're always going to compare the match with the mismatch conditions. If there is cross-linguistic influence, we expect that English speakers might be better at detecting possessor violations because that's the constraint that is shared between the English and the German grammar. But we also should see that Spanish speakers are making or are more sensitive or making more errors specifically in mismatch than match configurations. And this would be consistent with the idea that they're transferring their parsing constraint, possessee agreement, incorrectly to German. So the first experiment that I'll show you was a speeded acceptability task. I don't know, are you guys familiar, or should I don't know if it's, I know it's not super common in L3, but you do all kinds of experiments. So the idea in this is like people see an entire sentence and they see it word by word. So each word is presented fairly quickly. So people don't have time to reflect on it. And at the end of the sentence, they get a question. Was this sentence acceptable? And they have to say yes or no. And again, there's a time constraint. So if they don't reply within 2 or 3 seconds, the sentence times out and they move to the next trial. And in this paradigm, you can collect both their acceptance rates and also how long it takes them to give a response, which you can take as a proxy for their difficulty, right? So if it's easier to make that judgment, people should be fast. If it's hard to make the judgment, people should take longer. And the idea of putting the time constraints is that it should reduce the impact of metalinguistic processes. So we want people to just go with their intuition and not overthink it. Okay, so we run.
May I ask a question here?
Of course.
I mean, for some of these sentences, don't you need a context sentence to know whether it's seine or ihre? Sorry, there's some drilling going on here.
You all have drill. Are you all in the same building? That's why they're drilling, or are they separate drillings?
Some of us are in the office and they're drilling 1 floor above us. So most of the time it's fine, but right now they started. But my question is yeah. So he kissed his mother or her mother, I mean, they're both acceptable, right? Is there a context or a picture or something that to let them know what's intended here?
Yeah, I know what you mean. So in this case, we actually, what we told them is process this sentence. So we wanted to know if they could detect the possessor violation. And like you pointed out, this is not an ungrammatical sentence. This is just infelicitous because there's no antecedent in the context of the sentence. So in the instructions, we told them, don't try to overthink where the sentence was taken from. Just judge how acceptable it is based on the context of the sentence. And the idea was, yeah, that they, in that context, without any context around the sentence, they should think that the possessor violations are quite bad because there's no referent.
Okay, so the context of the sentence is no context.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, good.
Thanks. Yeah, that's right. Right. So just to say, we run this on the web. This is not because of Corona, but this was because, as you guys are probably painfully aware, it's really hard to find these type of speakers where you can, where you make sure they have these 3 languages. They don't speak any other language to a very proficient level, and they have acquired it in the order they acquired it. So to maximize our chances to find enough people and have more experimental power, we recruited people all over Germany, right? And we people also filled out a very detailed demographic questionnaire. And in particular, we collected 2 things that were important for us, were to have them rate their proficiency in the second and in the third language, right? So this is an example of the type of question you would see if you're an English native speaker. So you would be asked to ask your awareness of German, to your knowledge of German in the 4 skills, but you also would be asked to do that in Spanish, which was your second language. And of course, if you were a native Spanish speaker, you would rate it in English and in German.
Can I ask another question?
Sure.
Were the instructions in English for everyone?
No. If you were an English native speaker, the instructions were in English. If you were a Spanish native speaker, they were in Spanish. And of course, we also had German native speakers and they were in German. So we tried to instruct them in the language that was native to them because, when they're not in the lab and you cannot really troubleshoot questions, we wanted to make sure that they would complete it in a faithful way. So the task instruction, so everything else in the task is in German, but the demographic screen is in the native language. Okay, so now I'm going to show you what we found. You are going to see 2 plots. The one on the left shows their acceptance rates, so the proportion of trials in which participants accepted the sentences. On the right, you're going to see the response times, meaning how long they take to give their judgment. For the first set of plots, I'm going to focus on the effect of possessor violations. So I'm going to compare reactions to felicitous and infelicitous sentences, felicitous in blue, infelicitous in red. And I'm going to put the groups on the x-axis. So you always see English speakers on the left and Spanish speakers on the right. So let's look first at the acceptance rates. Here you see basically that both groups perform very similarly with possessor violations. So let me start with the easier pattern. They accept felicitous sentences most of the time. So the blue bars are close to 100%. But that acceptance rates go down when there's a possessor violation. So they're only accepting approximately a quarter of the time. This is connected, you might be wondering why not 0? Well, this is connected to the fact, like we said, these are not ungrammatical sentences. So if you imagine a context for them, they're not bad, but they're definitely accepting them less than felicitous sentences. Oh, and I should point out, I didn't tell you this, each dot is a person. So the acceptance rates of a particular participant. So you can see how much variability there is between them. But the crucial thing in this plot, or that you should get from this plot, is that we don't see any evidence that Spanish speakers are worse than English speakers in this task. Their performance with possessor violations are very similar.
Can I ask a question about that graph?
Yeah, please.
If there was a timeout is that treated as infelicitous, or are those data points disregarded?
Right, so if there's a timeout, then that trial basically is an NA, like participant did not manage to give the response. I don't recall whether the percentage of timeouts differ between groups. So for example, if you would see Spanish speakers timeout more than English speakers, that's a good question, but I can check it out, but I don't know off the top of my head. I can tell you the timeouts were really infrequent. So I think we lost between 2 and 3% of trials, but it could be informative to look between conditions. That I don't think we did.
And may I ask a super quick question also?
Sure.
It seems like there could be an interaction. Was there one?
No. You mean an interaction between condition and group, right?
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
You mean because it seems that Spanish speakers are a bit more likely to.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, it goes in that direction, but there's definitely no significant interaction between language group and condition. All right, so now let me show you the response times associated with these trials. And here what you see is actually a difference between the groups, meaning that when you look at the time it takes Spanish speakers to correctly reject an infelicitous sentence, that is longer than the time it takes English speakers. So here we do see some evidence that Spanish speakers are having more difficulty. They're taking more processing effort rejecting infelicitous sentences compared to the English speakers. Okay. So there is an interaction between condition and group. All right. Oh, wait, let me just check the chat. Oh, okay, this is not a question. All right, so the second thing I want to show you are the match effects. So here recall that we said we might expect Spanish speakers to, or we might expect errors in the Spanish speakers to arise in mismatch configurations. So that's where we can detect them. So now I'm going to show you the 4 conditions on the x-axis, including also dividing them into match and mismatch. On the y-axis, again, you have the percentage of accepted trials. And here what we see very clearly is that there doesn't seem any effect of match. So when you compare for infelicitous sentences, the match versus the mismatch, it's not the case that the Spanish speakers are being less accurate in the mismatch configuration. I'm plotting both English and Spanish speakers, so you have access to all the data, but it's the Spanish speakers where we explicitly wanted to see these errors under the assumption that they're transferring their parsing strategies. And the same happens with the response times. Okay, there's absolutely no effect of match anywhere. So to summarize, Spanish and English speakers seem to have similar error rates with possessives, but English speakers whose grammar encodes possessor agreement show less difficulty detecting its violations than the Spanish speakers. Ignore the slide. It should say English have less difficulty than Spanish. So we do see some role of L1 influence on the response times in German. What about L2 influence, right? I mentioned that these were not bilingual, they were trilingual speakers. So they also spoke Spanish or English as a second language with different degrees of proficiency. So we also wanted to see, does the L2 contribute in addition to the L1? For that, we used the self-ratings that the groups gave for their L2, and we used them as an additional predictor of their performance in the L3. Okay, so the models I'm going to show you always have the effects that you saw before, so they're L1, and in addition is taking into account L2 proficiency as a factor. And we're going to see if that modulates how they do with the possessor violations. So now on the y-axis, you have the, the y-axis is the same, is the acceptance rate, but on the x-axis, you have their L2 proficiency. So values closer to the left are lower L2 proficiencies, and values closer to the right are higher L2 proficiencies. So let me show you the Spanish speakers first. Here you see something interesting, which is that as the proficiency in English increases, Spanish speakers are less likely to make errors, meaning they are more likely to reject an infelicitous sentence and more likely to accept a felicitous one, which seems that having or reporting to have a more advanced English proficiency is making them better at detecting possessor violations in German. If you now look at the English speakers, you see quite a different pattern. So here it seems that English speakers, the way they perform in German is not modulated by the L2 proficiency. So speaking or knowing Spanish at higher proficiencies, Spanish lacking this constraint, doesn't make them worse in German, right? So that's a different type of pattern. So to summarize, what I think is interesting about these results is that they suggest that having knowledge of a second language can enhance performance in an L3 if the second language has the same constraint that the third language. But speaking a second language that doesn't have that constraint doesn't make it worse, right? So there's a I really hate that word, facilitatory effect of the L2, but not a hurtful or inhibitory one. And finally, I should say, we did not see any match effects. So that's the other thing that I would take from this, that the Spanish speakers are not acting the way we thought they would act, which was really puzzling for us at the time. Well, it's still really puzzling to us, to be honest. Okay, before I wrap up this section, I just want to say that we replicated the L1 influence effect using a different paradigm that did not require judgments. So one thing we wanted to know was, okay, this is a task where people are explicitly asked to judge, and they know that that's the nature of the task. What happens if they're now reading the sentences with the only constraint of understanding them? So the only thing we do is to ask them a comprehension question at the end of the sentence that has nothing to do with the possessor violation. For that, we used self-paced reading. I don't know if you're very familiar with this, but in this type of task, basically at the beginning of the sentence, the person sees a set of dashes, and every time they press the spacebar, a word appears and the previous one disappears. So you can take the difference in key presses as a measure of the reading of that word. Okay, so it's an indirect measure of reading, but it has been shown to correlate very well with reading measures. And yeah, as I said, there's no judgments here. They're just asked to read for comprehension. So the comprehension question would be something like, did Mrs. Schmidt go to the family reunion, right? So it never targeted the dependency between the possessive and the noun. The materials are the same materials that in the previous experiment. We kept them constant. And here what we hypothesized based on previous studies was that we should see a different immediately after the violation. So from self-paced reading studies in native speakers, we know that when native speakers read something that is inconsistent with their grammar or that they don't expect, they tend to slow down, right? So if that's the case, and if people can detect a possessor violation, we should see reading disruptions immediately after the possessor violation, compared to the condition where there's no such possessor violation. So again, we're interested in two effects. If we see, if there's L1 influence, we will expect that English speakers show stronger reading disruptions to possessor violations because they should be more sensitive to those violations. And we might expect Spanish speakers to be sensitive to the match between the two nouns, such that they're less likely to notice them if the pronoun agrees with the possessing noun.
Can I ask a clarification question here? So,
Yeah.
Oh, well, no, well, that's going to be clear, I think, because you're literally giving us reading latencies for each word, right? I was just going to ask where you look at this, because of course the match or mismatch effect comes after the pronoun, but okay, sorry.
Exactly. Yeah, it's actually what I'm going to say next. So thank you for the, the introduction. Yes. So as you know, self-paced reading, of course, you can look everywhere, and it's really tricky to know where you want to or where you expect to detect the effect. And this was even worse in this case because we were taking L3 comprehenders, and I had no experience with L3 comprehenders. So I have no idea the reading speed, you know, how early on they can do this. So we really went into this kind of, we knew that there should be some effect after the possessive. So it should not be before, that we know. But of course, there's many words after the possessive. So what we did, and I'll show you now in a second, is we kind of looked at the reading times without splitting the two groups, right? So we're pulling all the learners together. And we noted, and we basically looked at when the learners seemed to be detecting a possessor violation. In our case, this effect was pretty large and it was distributed on the 3 words immediately after the possessive, right? This is not weird because in self-paced reading, people typically have delayed effects. They don't typically show them at the word itself, but later. And in this case, they seem to be showing it in at least the 3 words after the possessive. So what I'm going to analyze was, I'm going to take an average of these 3 regions, comparing the English native speakers with the Spanish native speakers. Because I had no principal reason to expect that region 5 should be the one and not region 6 and 7. So I basically just looked at the region where they seem to show sensitivity to the violation and asked, okay, does this differ between groups? Is that your question, Jorge? Yes, no? What the rationale is for the regions? Oh, maybe he went.
Sorry, yes, no, I was nodding and doing this.
Right.
But yeah.
Okay, so this is what you see when you look at the average reading time across the 3 regions. Basically, what you see is that both groups show longer reading times for infelicitous sentences, but that sensitivity is much more pronounced in the English speakers. So the difference in reading times, or the reading disruption in an infelicitous sentence, is stronger for English than Spanish speakers. So again, that seems to suggest that there's some role for L1 influence, such that speaking a language or knowing a language that has that constraint makes you more sensitive to those violations in German as a foreign language. But again, when we looked at the match effect, expecting the Spanish speakers to screw up or for their screw-ups to emerge in the mismatch condition, there's no evidence that that is happening. So there's really no significant differences between the two, the match and the mismatch condition, either in felicitous or in infelicitous sentences. So from the second study, we get that English speakers whose grammar encodes possessor agreement are more sensitive to possessor violations than Spanish speakers. Here, we don't see any effects of L2 proficiency. So when we make the task a more implicit task where people are not, directed to judge, there doesn't seem to be a role of L2, either facilitatory or inhibitory. And we don't see match effects again. Okay, so regarding our research question, we see that both the native and the non-native grammars can affect sentence processing, but they do that in different ways, I would say. It's not a symmetric situation. So the L1 effects seem much more pervasive. We see them because English speakers find it easier to judge a possessor violation, so they take less time. They're also more sensitive to those during real-time reading. The L2 effects, on the other hand, are pretty selective. And again, this emerges in different ways. First, because that influence of the L2 is facilitatory, it's not inhibitory. So it's helping them, the English speakers, but the Spanish speakers, but it's not hurting the English speakers. And also because we only see it in the metalinguistic task. We don't get any evidence of that when they are reading for comprehension. This, there's a lot of things that one could think about it. This was just 2 studies, and we don't really have a big literature on L3 processing. So I don't know what the patterns will be with other things, but if these patterns tend to can be extended or turn out to be replicable, this might suggest that L1 effects are pervasive in L3 comprehension. And perhaps that's because the native mechanisms that people use to parse are the ones that are easier to recruit when people are reading sentences in real time. On the other hand, when we look at the L2 effects, those may require more metalinguistic awareness, and therefore they may be more restricted in processing. right? So most of the evidence that we have about L3 is with this type of metalinguistic judgment tasks. So I think we just don't have enough evidence yet to figure out how much those effects extend to real-time comprehension in the absence of judgments. But of all these things, you know, the thing that I really was cranky about and that kept annoying me was why not the match effects? Because the whole reason we thought Spanish speakers would struggle was because of their L1 grammar. But if that were the case, if they are performing badly because they're transferring their grammar, then we should have seen an influence of the match between the two nouns. So in the next two slides, I'm just going to tell you what my speculation is. And in the second part of the talk, I'll try to address that possibility. But this is really, at this point, a lot of speculation because this was really unexpected. So what I thought at the time was, well, all these possessive errors that we have in previous literature, they come from production tasks. And in production, the processing is slightly different in that in production, people start from the concept and they go to the form of the words. So when someone is producing a possessive, they already know the possessee object. So for example, if I want to say Jane kissed his father, I know what I want to say. I know it's about Jane and the father. So at the point where I'm articulating my possessive, those two nouns, the possessor and the possessee, they are coactive in memory. And maybe that coactivation is what causes the error to begin with. Compare this with comprehension, right? When people read a possessive in our tasks, they don't know what noun is coming after the possessive, right? In the judgment task, the noun appear later. In the self-paced reading task, they have to press the space bar. So they don't know if the noun after his is father, mother, dog. So perhaps the absence of that coactivation between the two nouns prevents them from transferring their L1 syntax, right? We don't have the same situation where there's two things active in memory and people have to select the right one. So this could be one reason why we don't see match effects in the comprehension paradigms that we tested. How to test that? Well, we need some kind of comprehension paradigm where both nouns are known to the listener or to the reader, such that the reader can anticipate the next noun at the point of encountering the possessive. And for that, yeah, I have my second part of the talk where I'll talk about that. But before I do that, maybe you have questions or something that you want to add. There's a question from Natalia, right? Was there a difference in German proficiency between the groups? People answer this question in different ways. And so I can tell you the two possible ways to answer it and you can judge. So some people just compare the groups in proficiency statistically. And if they don't get an effect, so if they get a null effect, they conclude that the groups don't vary in proficiency. This is quite not a good idea because you're using a null effect to infer that there's no difference. What we did is all our models always have German proficiency as a predictor for the two groups, such that if there are proficiency differences, those should be accounted for using that predictor. And everything else that you detect should be partialing out the effect of L3 proficiency and also age of acquisition. So we use both things to make sure that that's not the case. I don't know, Natalia, what you had in mind. Yeah.
Yeah, I meant, so I really like the analysis that you did with L2 proficiency as a predictor, so English proficiency as a predictor. So I was just wondering if it would make sense to do the same for the German proficiency self-rating.
I see what you mean. Yes, this we did because all the analysis of L2 proficiency also had L3 proficiency. So both were predictors for the reason I said, because we didn't want to confound. It's very possible that someone who's very good in English is also very good in German. So they might be confounded. No, they were not, well, let me qualify that. They're not interesting effects of proficiency. We do see, of course, that if people are very proficient in German, their response times are faster and they're more accurate. But not that there is an interaction between the condition and the proficiency, right? So you get what you would expect, which is people who speak German at a better level are faster and make less errors. I'm very bad at keeping order, so maybe I don't know, Julia, maybe you were next.
No, I think Marit was before me.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Well, thanks a lot. This is really interesting, and I think that this is a direction that L3 research should go, look more at processing. I would just like to say that I think that there is really something to the explanation that you had at the end, why you don't see this match effect, because the whole time I was wondering, is this match effect really a thing? Do we know that it is a thing? I mean, also considering Jorge's comment earlier. And as you explained, given that, you know, when they see the possessor, they don't know what the following noun is going to be. So they don't know if it's going to be a match or a mismatch. And of course, you were testing both things with exactly the same sentences. So if they react to one thing, then maybe their concentration is gone, I don't know, towards the end of the sentence. But can I make a comment? You mentioned 3 models of L3 acquisition at the beginning, and you didn't come back to them. And as you may know, there are more models. In fact, there is one that we have developed here in Tromsø called the linguistic proximity model. And even though we haven't done any processing studies yet, we would really like to, because our take on transfer is that it's not really transfer, it's just co-activation in real time. Co-activation of what is structurally similar, but there may be other factors that affect the strength of the activation. So we're hoping to go in the same direction as you. I also think that the TPM, even though it, and of course Jorge maybe want to defend it more than I can, even though they assume wholesale transfer at the initial stages, it's really just a model of the initial stages, and your learners are advanced. And I think the TPM people also assume that stuff can happen in processing at later stages. And also the L2 status factor, I don't think that, I mean, I know they don't say that only non-native grammar is transferred to the L3. They say that both grammars can transfer, but the L2 is privileged, especially at early stages. So since there's no one here to defend the
You're
L2,
doing it.
I thought I would at least mention that on their behalf.
Right. Yeah, no, thanks for the comment. I have to say, yes, I'm aware of the, I actually read your, it's not a review. What's the name of these articles where you outline a model?
The keynote?
The keynote, there you go.
Second language research, yeah.
I have to apologize. So these slides are actually from 2 years ago, I think, which is where I was doing this work. And I have to admit, I did not update references for these slides. So there's a lot of things missing and other types of, I don't know if to call them models, but proposals that have emerged. They're more like claims. People, you know, in processing, when we talk about models, I think we have a more specific type of thing in mind. I think these are more like ideas about what could matter. And the reason I think I look at these models is when we started this, well, there were nothing compared to that for processing. So we took the inspiration from the acquisition models, but of course we knew that these are not models that are supposed to account for people that have been living in Germany and using German for the last 10 years. So we just thought, okay, we take the spirits of this model, of these models as guiding points for what we might expect. But yeah, as you said, and I haven't come back to this model because, to be honest, presenting this stuff, I generally don't present this. This was work done with a PhD student that was really into L3, and I kind of tagged along because I was interested in the processing part. But her experience presented at conferences has been quite strange in that it seems like there's a binomial distribution of people who use this to interpret what it means for these models, and people who say, well, you should not even be talking about these models to begin with. So we have learned that it's a bit unpredictable whether we should relate it to the models or not. But I want to say, if you take, it definitely doesn't support any of them, in my opinion, in that even for typological primacy, which is the model that I think is closer to the data, if you don't make any additional assumptions, then you should basically see that the two groups perform similarly. The English speakers, because they're transferring their native grammar, English, and the Spanish speakers, because they're transferring English as a second grammar. So to map this to processing, you would have to make an assumption that it's more, or the grammar that is your native grammar transferred to a larger extent than your L2 grammar, or you have to make additional assumptions. And I think this is very possible, but to my mind, it's like we need a lot more data before we start. I don't want to propose the revised TPM for processing, because I think we really need a lot of more processing experiments to figure out how generalizable these patterns are. But taking the models at face value and assuming that they can be used to make predictions for processing, I don't think the evidence is fully compatible with any of them. So that would be my attempt to relate it. And yeah, I definitely think if you guys are starting to do processing experiments, this would be really useful, because I think we need more nuanced models the moment we tackle processing. There's a lot of factors that are going to affect, like proficiency, exposure, dominance, and without knowing what the data looks like, we don't even know how to fit those factors in the model, like what role to assign to them. Julia, maybe now it was you.
Well, I can ask quickly. Well, I really like the studies, and I especially liked this intriguing effects of L1 and L2. And so I want to ask just clarification question about the L2 proficiency, coming back to proficiency, maybe I understood. So when you talk about proficiency, at least in the L3, you tested their knowledge, right, of the possessives in the L3 German. But was it tested in the L2s as well?
That's a very good question. No, we did not test it in the L2. Yeah, right. We cannot make sure that they are aware of that construction in the L2.
Yeah, so you only tested proficiency in the L2 based on the other things, right? So not related to the phenomenon. No.
Exactly. Yeah, this was just a generic, how proficient are you in each of the 4 skills? So not specifically to processors.
Yeah.
That's right.
I think it may be interesting also to test. I actually know this in the L2. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, that's definitely something we should have done. At the time, we didn't think of that. Yeah. Jorge?
Yeah, I'm just gonna go very quickly because I don't want to keep you. But I was thinking when you were kind of saying, well, this is puzzling, how do I interpret that? And I there was something that kind of triggered in my mind when you said, well, why don't we get it in the absence of an explicit metalinguistic response? And then I see, maybe because I've worked on it, and of course I know a lot of your work from that, I see that this is ultimately, it's also attraction work, right? Agreement attraction in a way. And so I was wondering whether you see any connection to Hammerly, Dillon and Staub's stuff about a response bias playing a role here? Do you think, because what seems, they seem to be given an account, okay, agreement attraction can be explained in terms of response bias. And the recurrent question I've had when I've read their paper, and actually when we've been trying to kind of fit some eye tracking stuff that we did on gender agreement recently with Ian Cunnings, in light of their proposal, is what should I expect in something like eye tracking during reading, where I don't have, I'm not asking for an explicit response. And I think this is kind of like the difference between your 2 tasks here. So that's not an explanation in any case, I think. But unless you go deeper into whatever they hypothesize causes that. But do you think it's just literally that they're lacking an explicit response that might be the reason why you see or you don't see it? Because they go into drift diffusion and stuff, but I don't know if you buy that at all. What do you think?
That's an interesting question. I think, okay, so there's a couple of assumptions. So the first one would be that this effect is kind of an attraction effect, right? Like right. And the second would be that
which it doesn't have to be. Sorry. No, I said which it doesn't have to be. I'm just that's my
I'm
bias
just trying to systematize what has to hold, and then I answer. And the second would be that it's not about implicit or, well, I wonder how you would even differentiate explicit, implicit, and whether there's a response, but it's really about whether they have to judge. Okay. You know, I don't know. I think that the Hammerly idea is intriguing. To my mind, we actually don't know if response bias plays any role in eye tracking. I mean, I think their assumption would be that it should play less of a role. I'm not sure that's true, because I think it's too simple to say, oh, decisions are just pressing accept or reject a sentence. When you move your eyes, if you take most models of eye tracking, or not tracking, but fixation, like
Easy Reader.
Easy Reader, exactly. Yeah. This is inherently a decision task. You have to decide when have you collected enough information to move your eyes to the next word. So I don't think there's no decision component there. The question now would be, is the decision to move eyes fundamentally different from the decision to pressing keys? And then we can talk about that. You know, I think in the end, it's an empirical question. I wouldn't know. To my mind, it's a decision process. Whether it has the same effect, I don't know. But yeah, it's something that definitely, if you guys, it would be interesting if someone actually verifies whether that's true, whether response bias has a different effect depending on implicit measures versus explicit ones. I don't know. Yeah, it's a very good point. All right, let me tell you about the second part where we try to resuscitate the match effect. Where I tried it. My colleagues were perfectly happy with these results. I was the only one that was really frustrated that Spanish speakers were not screwing up in the way I wanted them.
I just wanted to mention very briefly that we're definitely breaching the time, and I think mostly the people who don't have other responsibilities later are going to stay. But in any case, if you could maybe condense it a little bit. I know that you wanted to focus on that one,
yeah.
But just so people can see something, and this will definitely be posted on YouTube as well.
And I should say this one is about 10 minutes. So the first part was the most long one.
Excellent.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. But I want to do the second part only because that's the one I haven't talked to you about before. So I want to tell you something you don't know. Okay, so in the second part, we looked at the other side of this coin, which is possessee agreement. And yeah, just to remind you, possessee agreement is the relationship between the suffix of the pronoun in German and the upcoming noun. They have to agree in gender. And that's fundamentally different from possessor agreement, because possessee agreement is a forward-looking relationship, meaning that in comprehension, possessee agreement allows people to predict something about the upcoming noun. So specifically, if I get a masculine suffix on the pronoun, then I know that a masculine noun has to come next, and the same with feminine. So the question here would be whether those type of gender predictions or gender-based predictions are easier for Spanish speakers who should have an advantage, both because their L1 has gender compared to English speakers, and also because they have possessee agreement. So they have both the syntactic constraint and gender in their native language. So that's a question that we set out to address. And again, here we're comparing Spanish and English native speakers. Now this is just bilingual speakers, meaning that German is their second language. All right, so we have two groups of speakers. Again, they are living and working in Germany, so their level of German is pretty good. They're intermediate to advanced, and they vary in the nature of their native language. So one group has English as a native language and another has Spanish. I'm going to go quickly over this part. Basically, again, we ensure that they know how possessee agreement works in German. So there's a task after the experiment, and they need to perform at least 75% accurate in that task. And of course, we make sure that they know the gender of the nouns that we're going to test. So the eye tracking data, I'll show you, it's only done on the nouns that people produce the correct gender for. Because of course, if you don't know the gender of something, you cannot predict it, but that's not a processing problem. That's just a knowledge problem. In this project, we are using visual world eye trackers, visual world eye tracking, in which comprehenders view objects on a screen while they hear sentences. and the predictions are assessed by whether they show anticipatory looks to some objects prior to hearing their names. Specifically in our task, when the L2 speakers came to the lab, we introduced them to two characters, Sarah and Martin. We said, okay, these are Sarah and Martin, they are roommates, they live together, but their house is super messy, and now their parents are visiting. So can you help them find their belongings so they can clean up? And please do it very quickly because the parents are about to arrive any minute now. So we put some time pressure on the learners. During the trials, participants saw two objects on the screen while they heard an instruction like click on his or her blue button. And we'll talk more about the instruction in a second, but what is important is that both the possessive and the adjective in the instruction were gender marked, which allowed participants to predict the upcoming noun. We diagnosed the existence of predictions by measuring whether participants showed a preference for the button over a competitor object when they heard, before they heard the object button in the instruction, right? So are they looking more at the target object prior to actually hearing it on the instruction? That's the window for prediction effect. Our critical sentences were presented in one of two conditions. In the match condition, the possessor and the target object agreed in gender. So they were, for example, both masculine, Martin and the button. In the mismatch condition, they disagreed in gender. So the target object was masculine, but the possessor was feminine. And again, we're interested in whether the Spanish speakers will be more likely to make errors in mismatch configurations. So if they just heard a possessive that has a feminine stem, are they more likely to wrongly look at a feminine target instead of a masculine one? So again, we have two effects that we're interested in. One is their ability to make gender predictions across the board, regardless of the condition. The other is their sensitivity to match effects. If there's cross-linguistic influence, we might expect Spanish speakers to be better at using gender to predict because they have possessive agreement and they have gender in their L1. But we also might expect them to be more tripped up by in the mismatch configurations. And notice that here, and this is what I was telling Marit before, here they actually know what object is coming, right? Because from the beginning of the trial, they see the button and the bottle. So now we have a situation where in comprehension, the identity of the possessive noun is predictable, in contrast with what we did in the other set of experiments. Okay, so I should clarify that we were not interested in simply whether the L2 learners would predict. This is what most work has been done so far. Can L2 speakers predict? We did not doubt that they could predict because they have been living in German for very long. They have very good German. We kind of thought, oh, they should predict. Our question was more specifically, which was, are they more able to predict or are they faster at predicting if their L1 also has this constraint? Right? So we're interested in the onset, in the beginning of that prediction and trying to see if it's earlier in the Spanish group. Here's where we hit kind of a roadblock because we could not find a method that allowed us to statistically compare the onset of predictive effects between groups of speakers. So we had to develop a new method, and we developed a bootstrapping approach that allowed us to calculate the onset of predictions in visual world data and compare it between groups. And we recently published a paper explaining the method with publicly available data and code. So I know many of you are working in eye tracking. So if you want to try it out, please do and let us know how it works for you, because we're still, of course, perfecting this method. Maybe in the interest of time, if no one opposes, I can just skip how the method works. Just believe me that it diagnoses the onset of an effect. If you're interested in the question period, I can tell you a bit more, but I had a short explanation on how you would go about doing this type of thing. The important thing is that this method gives you what you see here, which is the average onset of an effect and a temporal credible interval, meaning the temporal variability around that onset. In our case, we calculate 95% credible intervals, meaning it's 95% likely that the onset is in the time signaled by the credible interval. All right, so let me now show you the fixation patterns after the onset of the possessive pronouns. So 0 here on the x-axis is the onset of the possessive. On the y-axis, you have the percentage of looks to both of the objects, the target and the competitor. And the dashed lines are the onset of the actual words in the instruction, right? So the onset of the adjective, blue, and the onset of the noun. And of course, the predictive time window is the time before they actually hear the noun. So if there's predictions, we should see them in that time. All right, so focusing first on the gender predictions, regardless of the match mismatch, what we see is that shortly after the possessive, L2 speakers already show a preference for the target object. And this is the prediction effect. So they're more likely to look at the button before they actually hear button in the instruction. English speakers start showing the predictive effect about 720 milliseconds after the possessive onset, and the Spanish speakers do so after 800 milliseconds. So in case, you're surprised, we were surprised too, that first, there's no significant differences between the two groups in terms of onset. So the Spanish speakers are not better predictors. And if anything, the pattern is actually that they're a bit slower than the English speakers on average, right? So that is not what you would expect with L1 influence. The second question was about the match effects and whether the Spanish speakers are more likely to be fooled in the mismatch condition, consistent with the idea that they wrongly use the stem of the possessive to predict the upcoming noun. So to address this question, we looked at the difference in onsets between the match and the mismatch condition for each group. And indeed, we do see a match effect. We finally found it. The plot now shows the prediction onsets of the Spanish group for each experimental condition. The onset of the match condition is on the top. The mismatch condition is on the bottom. And what you can see is that there is a later onset in the mismatch condition, which is on average about 200 milliseconds later than in the match condition, right? So this suggests that they have more difficulty predicting if there's a mismatch between the two nouns. But when we look at the English group, we see a very similar pattern. So the onset in the mismatch condition is on average 140 milliseconds later than in the match condition. And when we compare the match effects between the groups directly, we find no evidence that Spanish native speakers have larger match effects. Instead, we see that both groups are misled in the mismatch condition, consistent with the general learner effect. So to wrap up, we don't find any evidence of L1 influence here, both because Spanish and English speakers are equally good predicting, and also because both are equally fooled in a match condition. And yeah, I basically had now 3 slides wrapping up the talk, but maybe we can just skip it for the purpose of time. So what I take from this, I don't know what you take, but what I would take is that learners' language background sometimes influences their ability to comprehend sentences, but that these effects are quite selective. They are not all over the place, affecting every possible measure. So we need much better models of when we expect L1 influence or cross-linguistic influence to occur. And I could say this in a million different ways, but I think I've already showed you some things. So sometimes you see in processing times an effect. Sometimes you see maybe the influence of the L2, but you only see it if there's a decision component or a metalinguistic task. We also see L1 influence with possessor agreement, but not with possessee agreement, as I showed you in the eye tracking data. So, and more surprisingly, I think the question that for me now is the most current one is, it doesn't seem that in comprehension, we're getting the same type of wrong application of a grammatical rule that people propose for production. And of course, the interesting question is why that is. What differences should there be between the interaction in languages depending on the modality? So that's something that I'm thinking about currently. All right, and that's it on my side.
Okay, we're giving you a very, very silent applause. Thank you so much for a great talk. Very well explained, and the slides were so appealing. Yeah, we can start with some questions or continue with some questions if there are any.
I think, Jorge, you had a question, or was it from before?
No, that's my hand is newly raised. believe it or not, I've just blanked. So I'm just going to say actually one thing that I wanted to say before, and I only sent to Janina because I had like a direct message activated. Your bootstrapping method was very timely, actually explained a couple of weeks ago in an internal lunch seminar that we had with Serge Miner, who's also from UIT, and they've been doing this super interesting work comparing web-based eye tracking to infrared eye tracking. And so one of the issues that we're looking at was, I mean, I think Natasha was involved in this, can explain better, but was whether, you know, what the onset of the effect was. And because of course it's noisier, web-based eye tracking is noisier. And so, you know, onset of the effect was one of the things they were looking at, and they were using the bootstrapping method. So this was actually, we went through it, and it's super interesting, by the way. So I think Natasha might be.
We are citing you, so it's
right.
No, but I want to know how it worked out. How did it pan out? Did you find it, was it reliable? I mean, normally with the bootstrapping method, it's very easy to check whether it's working because you put it on the fixation curve. So it should appear where you see the curves, you know, diverging. It's a very easy sanity check. How was it for the data that you collected online?
Yeah, we could replicate it, but we needed many more participants.
Okay.
I remembered my question. Can I quickly ask? So before I lose it again, actually, I'm kind of gonna play devil's advocate here, because this is about. I was wondering whether the fact that you find you at the end you were kind of saying like, well, we find this match effect or lack of a match effect or match effect, or do we find these things kind of like across both groups, and they were the mirror image. Mm-hmm. And you were like, well, this is kind of consistent with the learner effect. And I know this is something that Ana Stadler-Garcia has discussed in her thesis and so on, and I find it very interesting. But I was wondering whether for you to claim that, don't you need like learners with entirely different backgrounds, or at least something that varies, right? Because otherwise, I can also think, this is why I'm saying devil's advocate here, like you could kind of say, well, this is kind of hybrid influence, right? So if you have overall your background is the same, what you're disconfirming by showing the two groups with mirror image backgrounds show the similar effects is that order of acquisition doesn't seem to matter so much, rather than what your combined experience is. But if you want to show a learner effect, shouldn't that be true of like a French Urdu bilingual when you're exposing them to the same task, right?
So maybe I should have said, in this case, these are not trilingual, so they are Spanish or English speakers. And basically, by learner effect, I mean, regardless of your L1, you get screwed up by match.
Forget it. My mind was still on the.
Yes, no, I have no idea how I would ever get so many L3 speakers to come to the lab. It's a dream, you know, and I think if you are trying online methods, there's some promise there. But real life is really hard to get enough of these people in the city where you live that would come to an eye tracking lab. So I haven't yet even dared to try.
Tell us about it. And you were doing this in
Berlin, where you would expect
Berlin area, right?
So. But the ones that want to come to eye tracking experiments are not the hipsters that are living the life, I tell you.
Thank you. Sorry.
No, thanks for the question. Marit?
I have another comment about the mismatch condition, because it just seems so odd to me, because I don't quite get the mismatch between feminine and masculine, but we're not really talking about the same type of gender here. It's sort of semantic gender, and then it's nominal gender. And for me, they are to some extent quite distinct. So I wonder why, you know, iren should be a mismatch, you know, that there should be a mismatch in that word. It's a totally fine word in German, right? So I wonder if you have a comment on that. And then I have a question. What would you expect if the following noun was neuter? Is that also a mismatch?
Yeah, this is a really good question. So yeah, one thing, like you point out, I think possessor and possessee agreement, you can capture them at some level as both cases of gender agreement and syntactic gender, but possessor agreement is also fundamentally semantic, right? Like we want to know who owns what. And that has a lot of implications for comprehension. Whether the noun agrees with the head as in possessee agreement, that's just a formal process. Like your life is not going to be changed by making an error and saying, sign and, well, I cannot even do it in German. I won't try. But Right. So why would I expect to interfere? So what we found in, so one way to address your question would be, okay, would the same effect happen if you, instead of buttons and flowers, you had, or bottles, you had two animate nouns? But there you would have a more controlled or more similar environment, but you could still say, well, it's still the relationships are fundamentally different. This is true. But so I can just tell you a practical reason why we didn't do this. We need a lot of trials to appropriately estimate onsets, and it's hard to find enough family terms. You know, there's so many times you can say mother, and also how do you depict mother? You know, there were a lot of reasons that made us choose objects instead of animate nouns. If the two things are completely, and by the way, we didn't expect that if you hear iren, you look at a feminine object, right? What we expected is that if you're sensitive to both those genders, so if you cannot suppress the possessor gender when it comes the time to predict something, you should have more difficulty doing that suppression. And that's why we're looking, and that's why I said we're looking at the onset of the effect, not just at whether you're predicting or not, because I'm completely agreeing that people should always predict the right thing. It's just a matter of whether it's harder for them to get there if the possessor disagrees in gender. It could have been that the type of relationship in the possessor is so different that it should not difficult processing, but actually what you see here is that it does slow them down. So at some level, these two relationships are interacting in people's heads. Otherwise, they should have always looked at the button at the same time, regardless of whether the possessor was masculine or feminine. But I don't know if that was the spirit of your objection or you were objecting to something else.
I'll let someone else ask a question. I think there are other people and we're over time, but I was a little bit concerned about your last, you would expect them to look at the button every time. I mean, they are reacting to the difference between Mrs. Schmidt and Seine, but are they reacting to Seine and ihre relative to the following noun?
I see what you mean. So what you see is that they are, so here they hear seinen Knopf, so his button, and here they hear ihren Knopf, right? So both are perfectly grammatical sentences.
Okay.
They always hear the masculine suffix en. So they're always, as you can see, always look at the button. They're doing the right prediction. It's just that when it's ihren, that prediction seems to occur a bit later, which suggests that they have some difficulty, you know, inhibiting the feminine stem in the pronoun, and that is what's delaying them in their prediction.
Could it be that the feminine is somehow unmarked? So whereas the ending en is very clearly masculine, so that is a more salient signal for them? Yes, this is a possibility. So I should clarify, in half of the trials, the target object was masculine. So here you would have seinen, and here you have ihren. In the other half, the target noun was feminine. So you actually have the opposite. This would be ihre, and this would be seine. So we counterbalanced masculine and feminine target objects to make sure that it's not because one gender is more or less marked. But you're right, we could look at them separately to see if that additionally played a role. I think it's possible, it's very possible actually. I just don't know what are the facts in German regarding when you have three genders, which one should I consider the unmarked? Because feminine is much more common, I think, in German than in other languages. Well, but in the accusative case, I know what you mean. Right. It's really just masculine that is marked. Yeah. Yeah. And then you would consider neuter also marked then? So, well, it's different. Well, it's different from the feminine, but yeah. Of course, it's a question what. Yeah, it's an interesting question. But of course, it's related to case. They need to know case also. Yeah. And the ending en is very clear, a clear marker of case. Yeah. Yeah.
It's an interesting question for sure, because masculine is seinen, feminine is seine, and neuter is sein in this configuration. So you could think, oh, it's even less marked. I mean, there's basically nothing there, but I have no idea how to decide what counts as marked. Is it about, yeah. But yeah, it's a good point. We didn't test neuter nouns, so I don't know how it would work out. Natalia? Or Natalia's group?
Oh, yeah. I wrote something in the chat. I don't know if you saw it, but I was just interested out of curiosity. How many infelicitous and felicitous sentences did you have in the self-paced reading task? What was the distribution?
So it was half and half. It's always half are felicitous, half are infelicitous for each participant. So there's 24 items and 4 conditions. So people see, one person would see 6 felicitous items and 6 infelicitous ones.
But one person would not see the same, like the pair, the minimal pair, both of them, right? Yeah. No, I am asking because we were having this discussion here at some point about ungrammaticality or infelicitousness maybe in self-paced reading, that it might make the task more explicit and sort of make people develop strategies while they're reading, and then maybe you would find the effect that you want because of it. But I don't know what you think about that.
No, it's definitely true. I mean, this is a very important concern. If you want them to read naturally, you cannot bombard them with 430 infelicitous sentences, because no reasonable human being will continue reading naturally. So what you typically do in the self-paced reading task is all your fillers are grammatical, such that of the total number of sentences they see, in our experiments, for example, 15% or less, only 15% or less are ungrammatical. I think, this is what I've always done with native speakers. And I think with non-native speakers, ideally you would do the same. The problem, of course, is for them, reading is a more tedious process. So you cannot have them read 400 sentences in one session, because they would just give up at some point. So it's harder to make sure that your task at the same time has very few ungrammatical sentences, but also that it doesn't have so many fillers that people get really tired and you get completely flat reading times at the end.
So you did have, so all the fillers were grammatical. So you did have more grammatical items in the task. Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
And I should say, we always want to make sure that people are performing well. So I haven't shown you this data, but we always compare the 2 groups in the fillers, and they're always equally accurate in the fillers. So we make sure that it's not that one group is just better, or the Spanish group is more engaged because I'm Spanish and they want to do my experiment correctly. We make sure that the group differences are always in the experimental items, and in the fillers they are performing similarly.
Okay.
What about the speed and acceptability judgment? So did you have a 50-50 ratio there as well, or for kind of?
Okay, so you can stop now.
Malky, can you mute yourself? Sorry.
I'm so sorry. I'm testing and doing this. We're trying to hear this at the same time. I'm so sorry.
Yes, it was the same in the speed acceptability. So they were, the only difference in speed acceptability is that because of the thing that Jorge mentioned, meaning that you don't want response bias, in that case, half of the fillers are grammatical and half are ungrammatical, such that across entire experiment, people don't have a bias to think, oh, the majority of the sentences will be good or will be bad. So in the self-paced reading, you have a lot of fillers and they're all grammatical and different structures to distract people. And in the speed acceptability task, you have fewer fillers and they're 50-50, so 1-to-1 ratio of grammatical to ungrammatical.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
All right, seems the questions have died out.
I think everyone is
last
tired.
call. Oh yeah.
Sorry to take longer. Yeah.
Oh no, of course. It has happened before.
Okay.
We always get all so winded and kind of defending.
You're a very expressive group. This is good. I mean, it's
yeah. I agree. And you said yourself that you've agreed to maybe some extra time after the talk. So there we go. All right, going once, going twice. If there are no more questions, I think we can end here. And let's thank the speaker once again for a great presentation and also excellent responses to questions, very thorough. And thank you all for your attention. Yeah, let's adjourn. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Lago, again. Yes, of course.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye.